Welcome back. You're watching Sky News. We've got the press preview for you in a moment, checking out tomorrow's front pages. But first, our top stories tonight. South West Water says a broken air valve contaminated with animal faeces may be the source of a parasitic infection in water supplies. Sir Keir Starmer has set out the first things he will do if Labour wins the election, including cutting NHS waiting times and setting up Great British Energy. And authorities in Slovakia have charged a man with the attempted murder of Prime Minister Robert Fico. So, time for the press preview. It's our first look at tomorrow's front pages, and we're going to have a look at the headlines tonight with Steve Richards and Salma Shah. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. Nice to see you both. We'll chat in a moment after we've had a look at those front pages, beginning with the front of the Times. An internal NHS review finds hospitals are struggling to treat more people because thousands of patients are stranded on wards without anywhere to be discharged. The Telegraph has Chancellor Jeremy Hunt insisting that a Labour government would mean tax rises. And in fact, it's the same story you can see there on the front of the Express. While on the front of the Guardian, a report says government ministers were warned 3 years ago that unpaid carers were being treated unfairly. The Daily Mail reports on rumours of a £3.5 billion takeover of the Royal Mail by a Czech billionaire. The Metro leads with the story of a plumber who is accused of creating fake stories of helping people for free to raise millions in charity donations. BT's new chief executive lays out a new plan to turn around the struggling telecoms group. That's on the front of the FT tomorrow. On the front of the Mirror, the family of the youngest ever organ donor have a new addition to their family 10 years after they lost their baby. And the Star warns that 1 in 10 cats and dogs face hellish hay fever symptoms. And don't forget, you can scan that QR code that you'll see on screen during the programme. Check out tomorrow's front pages while you watch us discussing them. And doing that with me tonight, columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. Great, lots to talk about. Some different front pages, actually, for tomorrow. The Guardian going with no quick fix if Labour wins the election. All comes, of course, after Sir Keir Starmer announced his 6 pledges. I'm not sure what it is. Is he calling them pledges now? Missions? First steps. But many critics have said he's under-promising. And maybe that's why, because there isn't going to be enough money.
Well, I am going to start by saying that even though he made those 6 steps, pledges, today, I don't think I could name them. I think I might have to test you there, Steve, to see if you could name them. But actually, I'm going to let you make the point. We were discussing it earlier about sort of how the media follows the cycle of speeches and actually how you had more coverage of this in yesterday's papers before he'd actually made the speech, and now he's got the content of it. Actually, we only really see The Guardian covering this. I think it's fascinating, though, that the key point of this story on the front page of The Guardian is that a former Etonian who was once photographed in those famous Bullingdon Club photos with David Cameron and the chief executive of Boots is now endorsing Keir Starmer, which actually isn't insignificant, but actually still a bit of a small Westminster-ish story.
Yeah, Sebastian James. What did you make of his performance today and this idea?
The rhythm of the news kind of cycle is important in this, because reading the papers you would think it didn't happen, and yet it's very high up in your bulletins. You covered. I was watching Sky News this morning. It was on for hours, but in this morning's papers there was quite a lot. So what happens now, and it's happened for quite a few years, is things get previewed, and that's when they get prominence. Then they happen. And if you've missed it, you look, I wonder what was... And it's not there, And in fact, what are on some of the front pages of the Tory papers is the Tory reaction to it. So that's just the way it goes. We can have a look. When you mentioned it, let's bring it in. The front of the Daily Telegraph, Labour tax rises as sure as night follows day, previewing a speech that the Chancellor is going to make. Yeah, and it won't be in the papers tomorrow once he's made it late tomorrow. So first of the Guardian, I think no quick fix if Labour wins election is the headline. And it seems to me this highlights one of the great challenges of being an opposition, especially a Labour opposition. Is the message broadly reassurance, reassurance, reassurance? No quick fixes. Not much can change at first, things are tough, blah, blah, blah. Or is it inspiration, change of a really profound nature is going to happen? Now, that headline is reassurance, reassurance, reassurance. But it is a balance, and there needs to be, you know, the stories we're covering, you know, the Thames, not the Thames, but the water
Southwest
company.
Water, yeah,
it's Southwest Water. And some of the other stories we're covering demand social care. You highlighted the social care thing. Bed blocking. These are huge issues. Now, they're aware of it, Labour in the shadow cabinet, but they need to convey as well as, oh, there's no quick fix. I mean, if Attlee went around saying, well, the NHS is a quick fix in 45, it would have been laughed at. You know, you've got to both think big and reassure. And they're trying to do that, but it's tough and hard. And so this headline, no quick fix, is not exactly a clarion call.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big criticisms laid at his front door is that we don't know what he stands for. No one knows what Sir Keir Starmer stands for. Whereas now, and they call it doorstep offers, don't they, where canvassers can go and knock on doors and say, look, here's the card, here are the 6 first steps, this is what he stands for.
Yeah, apart from the fact that the 6 steps are quite generic, and I think that, I mean, as Steve says, that's the thing that's sort of very stark in contrast with the person that he is mimicking almost, which is Tony Blair, who had this big vision and was inspirational. And, lots of sceptics, I think, still in Labour about Blairism, but there was still that visionary piece. But just to go back to this Telegraph story, I think what you're now seeing is exactly that tit for tat, which is people now coming up to the point where they're creating these political dividing lines. So Keir Starmer sets out his 6 steps. He says, here's what I stand for, here's a rough plan for you voters to think about when you're going into the ballot box. And the Chancellor's coming back and saying, OK, you know, you can just see that Labour's going to keep taxes high, whereas I'm going to cut them. So here are those dividing lines that are materialising. But with that poll lead that Keir Starmer has currently, he clearly is not in a position, nor is he willing to take any kind of risk or chance by putting that big visionary piece out there. And I think perhaps there are a lot of people who will be frustrated that he isn't doing that at this point in time.
So 3 things arise from what Sam said. The Tony Blair, he was an artist in some respects. He did make the incremental sound exciting, but the 5 early pledges were incremental. They weren't conjuring up a huge vision. The second thing is that almost inevitably, whoever wins the next election is going to put up taxes. The Tories will have to, Labour will. The third thing is, in the pre-election tax and spend debate, it's like a child's game. You're not allowed to be candid. But the one advantage of Labour playing the very cautious, we can't fix things, we're not going to spend much, tough fiscal rules, is that Jeremy Hunt will not win this argument. They will not, Labour, give him the space before the election to win that sort of old 80s, 1992 style tax and spend debate. In that sense, they are following the new Labour rulebook. Only announce what you're going to show how you're going to pay for it. And so they can make as many speeches as they like, Jeremy Hunt and others, on tax and tax bombshells and all the old tricks they used to play. Won't work.
Yeah, OK, let's have a quick look at the front of the Daily Express then. Be warned, taxes will go up under Labour, says Hunt. Do you want to come back on any of that, Salma, that Steve just said?
No, I think Steve's right, because it's the same thing with the Express. And I think the reason why Steve and I wanted to look at these 2 things is because it is talking about the fact that actually there is still those, you know, right-leaning papers that are very much still distrustful of kind of Labour, the Labour brand around taxes, and still believe that actually conservative lower tax ideology still exists. But I would agree with Steve that, you know, the way public sector spending is going, it's going to be very hard to conceive of a government that's going to bring it back to even near pre-pandemic levels of taxation. So there's going to have to be, unfortunately, some very difficult discussions that nobody really seems to be having about what is the role of the state and what we should actually be spending on. But you have that coupled at the same time, which we'll come on to, low productivity in the NHS, water companies not being effective in terms of their infrastructure. And where do you start making those reforms? It's a very, very tough job.
Yeah, and it does move us on quite nicely to the front of the Daily Telegraph, which is, I mean, this is quite left field, Steve, isn't it? Mortgage wars as banks are cutting rates.
Yeah, well, you see, we've been here sometimes when the Telegraph front page has not been that helpful for the government, sort of veering towards pro-reform. It's quite a helpful front page for the government because it's saying, you know, splashing on the Hunt speech, taxes going up under Labour, and then interest rate cuts to come, sort of, you know, almost like the price wars, the interest rate wars, implying that by the time of the election, you know, that people will be paying less for their mortgages. They've had a very big hit recently, and so on. I still don't think it will make much difference because it's got beyond that point now, I think, where voters say, oh, yeah, I'm a bit better off. Oh, yeah, I'll vote them in again. We've had 14 years, let's have another 5. I think it's got beyond that. But these papers are going to pump it out, really.
I mean, what for you is going to be the main dividing line, do you think, over the next few weeks, the next few months?
Well, they've definitely decided that tax is going to be a big dividing line. But actually, interestingly, in the other story that we have on the front page of the Telegraph around the Chancellor's speech, actually there's going to be a lot of stuff on law and order. I think they'll continue with the immigration line. But this actually is about that surety of that one thing that they've been hoping for, is that cost of living improves. Yeah. And I think if you feel a little bit better off, then perhaps you're not going to be as inclined to be negative towards the Conservatives when it comes round to the next general election.
At the moment, the so-called dividing lines are very confused. I mean, Sunak made a speech earlier this week where he said, you need me, an experienced Prime Minister, everything is terrible. And by the way, there's great cause for optimism about the future. And to some extent, the Labour message, as it was in '97, is everything is terrible. Yeah. Don't worry, we're not going to change very much. Yeah. And now, if those two are the
Politics,
sort of dividing lines, it needs to say, it's a bit like music, it needs to be a bit more in both cases. Yeah. Flowing. Yeah.
OK, great. We will leave it there. Thank you both very much for the moment. Plenty more still to come, including the hospitals struggling to treat more people because thousands of patients are stranded on wards with nowhere to go. Do stay with us.
It's highly fatal. It's a synthetic opioid, as you mentioned. It's like heroin and morphine. And last year we've been talking about fentanyl. They add it to the heroin and give it to people, and people die immediately because of the power of fentanyl as synthetic opioid also. Nitazene is much more powerful, more fatal, and we have some fatalities this year everywhere in the UK. And because we have patients who are on addiction treatment and they take heroin, so we inform them, please don't take any heroin now without knowing what they are giving you. And the problem is the decline in heroin trade made drug dealers contaminate heroin with these things to sell because there's no heroin coming from Afghanistan. So nitazene is very dangerous. They can contaminate heroin with it. They can give you a tablet, say this is ecstasy or MDMA. They can give you a tablet which is diazepam, and it is nitazene, and people dying.
He and his friends have made a plan to go to Leeds Festival for the summer of August 2022. I dropped David off on a Thursday at the festival. And over the weekend, as we learned afterwards and subsequently, a number of things happened to David and his friends that ultimately led to the point where David took MDMA, what he thought was MDMA, on the Saturday night. And unfortunately, whatever David took or however much David took, it proved fatal. And the next day, he died. I think for parents, first of all, we're the first line of defence. And together with our friends, we really need to equip young people to be ready for the festival experience and what will happen to them. So remember, David was 16, and there are lots of 16 and 17-year-olds attend festivals like Leeds and Reading because it falls at the time that they get their GCSE results. They are unable to buy alcohol. Alcohol purchasing is really strictly enforced on festival sites. And so they're easy prey for drug dealers who see an opportunity to sell them drugs. And in David's case, it was exactly that. They'd run out of alcohol on the Saturday, and they were offered something free initially, and then something else happened where they purchased some drugs. But ultimately, they were groomed to the point where they decided to take a step that ultimately proved fatal for David.
Hello again, welcome back to the press preview. Columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah are still with me. Let's have a look at the front of the Times. Steve, perhaps you can kick things off for us. The headline, Bed Blocker Crisis means extra NHS cash wasted.
Yeah, in politics, everything connects. So we were both agreeing before the break that they will have to spend more money. Whoever comes in will have to raise taxes at some point. And here is one of the reasons why. The NHS is getting more money, but they can't get people out of the beds because they've got nowhere to go to. The reason they've got nowhere to go to, or one of the reasons, is there's no sort of social care plan. One of the early objectives, allegedly, of Boris Johnson. Still not there. But if you don't have one, this carries on. So you could put in more doctors and all the rest of it. But there's a bed crisis because you've got nowhere else to put them.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting question here as well, because this story is saying that despite the extra funding, despite the extra staff that has gone into the NHS...
Yeah, £20 billion increase in funding and about 15% more doctors and nurses.
Yes, so despite that, you still have an 11% deficit on productivity, which is the term of, you know, how quickly the patients are being seen and how quickly they're being discharged from pre-pandemic levels. So actually, this is a real sort of managerial issue in terms of the NHS. And I was just thinking, while I was reading this, is that actually Julian Kelly, who's the finance director of NHS England, is the person that's quoted in this. So this is an NHS England sort of independent from government department run improvement plan, and this is the entity that has looked at this and created this report. So I think there is, you know, some confidence that can be taken that actually what we're looking at is not some politicised statement. It is really what is happening in the NHS today.
It's a huge issue for so many people. Were you surprised that Sir Keir Starmer didn't mention it today? That it wasn't one of his first steps, sorting out social care?
Oh, social care, you're right. It's a huge issue. And it's an absolute failure across the board of political will that it hasn't happened. It keeps on coming up. You know, there was this famous independent Dilnot report. Gordon Brown was going to do it, then he couldn't. And then Johnson mentioned it outside number 10 in his first speech as Prime Minister, always a totemic moment. Nothing happened. He put up national insurance, all reversed. And the reason he didn't was, again, our earlier discussion, tax and spend. It's expensive. But the advantage is, if it's organised well, this particular issue is then addressed because they do have places to go. But the initial upfront cost is a lot, and we have to pay for it, and we have to have a grown-up discussion about how it's going to be regulated and staffed, and Sam was an expert on staffing and regulation.
Huge issues. We're out of time. Well, we can perhaps talk a bit more about that after 11 o'clock. Steve, Salma, thank you both. We'll have the top stories and more stories from inside the papers as well, all in a couple of minutes.